And we also have from the beginning, right from the beginning of of the American colonial times in the Philippines, we have photos of armors that the Filipinos wore, of weapons that they used, and we even have films showing how they were used. There's a lot of documentation on that. So we actually do have a very good idea on how these weapons were used. The documentary also does not really explore how Filipino martial arts were hidden over the centuries. Of course, it goes into saying that there are aspects of it that were mixed with Spanish fencing. Of course, if you compare Spanish fencing with arnis, you will see great differences, even when you have disciplines like espada y daga, for example. But what it fails to tell, and what I think J. Ignacio, as well as most Filipinos, don't know, is that in the 300 years of Spanish colonial times, for the most part, Spain or the Spanish mostly stayed in Manila and in Cebu and in cities like that, in harbor cities. They did not really reach out to the rest of the Philippines for a very basic reason, as imperialism and colonialism primarily was an economic endeavor. So what we had, for the most part, during the Spanish times was that silver was collected in Latin America, brought together in Acapulco, and shipped from Acapulco to Manila in something that we call either the Manila Galleon or the Manila Acapulco Galleon. And in Manila, they were traded off for goods from China, for goods from India and Japan, and so on. So trade from Asia to Europe went through all kinds of cities like Singapore or Kuala Lumpur and so on. But when it was trade from Asia to America, it all went to Manila, and from Manila to Acapulco. And the Spanish didn't really care about going all too much into the provinces, which is why we, in the 20th century, we still had tribes like the Ifugao or the Taot Batu and so on, or why Mindanao was able to preserve so much of its indigenous culture while they were still writing in Arab Abjad up until the 20th century, or why they still had the traditional martial arts systems that was briefly touched here, because there were no Spanish there. Spain didn't really care about this because Spain had the income from the import-export business that they were doing in Manila. It was only when Mexico became independent that Spain had to create an economy inside the Philippines so that the Philippine colony would still be profitable for Spain. Ultimately, the question while watching it and while rewatching it twice was, who is the target audience? And I'm still not sure who the target audience is. I watched this documentary recently about karate in Okinawa on NHK World, and it showed foreigners who went to Okinawa to learn karate there and showed their lives. So NHK World definitely tried to make a documentary promoting karate by showing foreigners learning karate. So that was very well done, as it was very focused. And A Brick Through Stone, you had this focus of Chinese expatriates who were living in Borneo and were practicing traditional Chinese Kung Fu there, and had the problem of not having a successor or trying to find successors. But in The Bladed Hand, you are all over the place. Nothing is really being explored, nothing is really being discovered, nothing is really being gone into in depth, so that at the end of the day, when you watched it, you don't really remember anything. Personally, I would have not visited that many people. Seriously, especially the Hollywood part. This is something that action movie fans, especially action movie fans with Filipino heritage, will probably appreciate, because they can then say, oh yeah, the Philippines were shown in Hollywood movies. And I know a lot of Filipinos will probably respond positively to that, saying that, oh yeah, our martial art was used in the Book of Eli, was used in Mission Impossible 3, had some influence on Avatar, The Last Airbender, and so on and so forth. But the reality is that this is not what makes the martial art. So at the end of the day, you still don't know what it is. I would have loved if the documentary would have explored more of the stuff like, for example, what weapons do you use and why do you use them? It's briefly mentioned at the beginning, but it's not just stick, it's not just sword, it's not just knife. There's also some systems use longer sticks like spears. And how does this transition, for example, into unarmed combat? As you probably should know, Filipino martial arts has one set of systems that it simply transfers to other weapons. So you will use the same system that you use with your sword, you will use with your stick, with your knife, or unarmed. You just have to make some changes, some tweaks for it to work. And this was missing here. There was a very deep understanding that is required to talk about this topic missing. Nevertheless, I think that the documentary has a lot of very good elements that you should see. For example, they explain to you more in depth why there's Kali, Eskrima, and Arnis. They also go a bit into showing other systems, even though they are not really explained, like Boltong, like Silat, and the documentary also shows you changes that were made in the 20th century to make Arnis more accessible to the general public. So all of that, definitely good, but the advertising part and the lack of knowledge on the subject matter really showed at some point. It's not Jake Nasio's fault in general. It's more the fact that he was working alone, or that he had to work alone. Because if he had worked in a team with more people, like say 30, 40 people, and with editors and people who correct stuff, fact checkers, things would have been a lot easier. If he had more access to national archives and to academic work on the subject matter, things would have been a lot easier for him to do. Given the limitations that he had and that he managed to partially overcome to make this documentary, I definitely would tell you to go watch it. As a complete novice to the topic, you will learn some things. If you are somewhat literate in Filipino martial arts and in Filipino martial art history, you will not see a lot of new things. So I know I've been bambling on a bit, and this probably was difficult to listen to, but like I said, it was an impromptu video, just showing my reaction, and I hope you liked it. Please tune in next time, and till then, see you.